Hello, I'm Delia, Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust for Birmingham and the Black Country. Thank you so much for joining us this evening at our second digital event as part of our celebrations for the Trust's 40th anniversary. This evening's event is all about celebrating the actions of people who we consider to be wildlife heroes. We will be hearing from the wildlife heroes from the Trust's history and hopefully inspiring some of you to take some action to become a wildlife hero too. Also, I wonder if you would please consider making a donation to our 40th anniversary fundraising appeal. Your support really does help us protect and restore wild spaces and places across Birmingham and the Black Country. It's really important that you support us in this effort. So it's time for me to welcome and hand over to your host for this evening, local journalist Adrian Goldberg, who will be talking to 4 special wildlife heroes who helped to make the Trust what it is today. Thank you for joining us. I really do hope you enjoy the event.
Delia, thank you very much indeed. Some of you watching this might think of me as primarily an investigative journalist. I work on File on 4 on Radio 4 and had a show on 5 Live for a decade called 5 Live Investigates. But some of you, maybe those with greyer hair than others, may also know that I've been an environmental journalist too, promoting a greener lifestyle and extolling the virtues of nature on a programme that I used to present on Radio 5 Live, the purpose of which could often be misunderstood because the programme was called Dirty News. I'm also a born and bred Brummie who supports a Black Country football club up the Baggies, and as a family we are fully paid up members of the Wildlife Trust for Birmingham and the Black Country. My 5-year-old daughter's idea of heaven is a ramble around Moseley Bog. So I would personally like to thank the wildlife heroes who so hard to protect and promote our valuable urban green spaces. So between now and 7:30, we're going to hear from people who've given so much of their time and energy and talent to making where we live a better place. We're going to hear from Alison Milward, Chris Baines and Mike Bloxham, wildlife heroes all. And that's pretty much the theme for tonight's 40th anniversary celebration. Let me introduce, though, first, another one of those wildlife heroes, Peter Shirley. Peter was one of the founders of the Trust, former chair as well, and a long-time conservationist. Peter, hello, how are you doing?
Hello, Adrian. Fine, thank you.
Now, wildlife trusts are something that I guess we take for granted these days, and I'll ask something around this of most of our interviewees tonight, but just give me a sense of how it all started for you.
Well, it started for me because I'm a Black Country person, lived in the Black Country all my life, and was always interested in natural history. And we've got a Natural History Society here that Mike Bloxham is a member of. And we were invited to a conference in Birmingham about wildlife in the city. And I found, rather to my surprise, that the people from the nature conservation organisations who were at that conference were very dismissive of wildlife in towns and cities. And they were also quite hostile to the idea that it was there to be appreciated, enjoyed, and to be part of people's lives. It was in the days when nature reserves were the things that conservation organisations had, and the idea of a nature reserve 40 odd years ago was to put a fence around it, lock the gates and say you can only go in by special permission. So that's how I got started with the trust, and as a few other people as well came from the same sort of background. We didn't come from the conventional nature conservation background.
So what was your background then?
Well, at the time we started the trust, I was in commerce. I had my own shipping agency, so I got a business background, and actually, like a lot of other people in the 1980s, came across with a business background to what was then a rapidly expanding conservation sector, which really needed people that had got the experience of managing organisations, managing money, and so on. And at the time, they were needed alongside the biologists, the botanists, the entomologists, and so on, who were the technicians, if you like, and the people who really knew about wildlife.
So tell me about fundraising in the early days then. What kind of sums did you need to raise and how did you go about it?
Well, to start with, we had absolutely nothing. Except the one thing we did have was a lot of people, because there were temporary employment schemes in the 1980s, which enabled charities and other organisations to employ people without any cost to them. So we got the most important resource, which was people. But the organisation had got no money at all. I mean, in 1982, I think our total income was £3,500. And 2 or 3 years later, it was still only just over £20,000, which by today's standards is like petty cash. It's what you find down the back of the sofa these days, in a lot of organisations. But what we had got here was a lot of public funding, either through what was then the Nature Conservancy Council, a government body, and the Countryside Commission, another government body, but also through the local authorities and central government funds for Birmingham. We initially got our first lot of major funding from something called the Inner City Partnership, which was there for regeneration work. And it's very easy, as you will know, to link environmental improvements, which include nature conservation, open spaces, green spaces, and so on, to link all that sort of thing with improving people's quality of life, improving neighbourhoods, and for us as well, making things better for wildlife.
So in a sense, the money was there from central government and local government. It was about finding a way to access it, which I guess the trust was that vehicle, that conduit.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes, and that's what we were able to do, and we had to be quite inventive in those early days. 10, 15 years later, there were sea changes in the funding. First of all, there was the National Lottery, which started in 1994. And then there was something called landfill tax, which came in 1996. And they were game changers for organisations like ours. But for the first 10 years, it was very hand to mouth. And I can remember after I moved over to be employed by the Trust, because we got funding to employ a senior manager, a director, we were working sometimes under rolling redundancy notices because money was that tight. And we didn't really know in 6 months' time if we'd be able to keep the staff. But one way or another, we struggled through and we got there.
So that was then. This is now. How have those funding streams and the methods of fundraising changed over time?
Well, as I said, there were two major changes in the 90s. The whole scale and scope of fundraising has changed in the charitable sector, including nature conservation. I mean, when we started in 1980, our 3 neighbouring wildlife trusts each employed, I think, 1 person. And that was a fairly recent innovation from being completely run by volunteers. And now trusts have establishments of anything from 20 or 30 people up to a couple of hundred. The whole background of how we work and what we do has changed enormously. But what is really important, and for anyone watching this, what is really important is to be able to receive money that's donated for the Trust's general purposes. Because in the early days, all the funding we got was project funding, which meant it had to be spent on a specific thing, whatever the project was about, whether it was parks or local nature reserves or whatever. And it's really important that the public continue to support organisations like this with their donations and their membership subscriptions, to give organisations the flexibility they need to do the things that they know need to be done.
Yes, the things that are a bit off-piste, but which know need to be done perhaps outside and around a project. Yeah. I should say, by the way, if anybody's watching this and wants to share their wildlife hero stories, use the hashtag wildlife hero, and please share your wildlife hero stories on Facebook or Twitter. That would be absolutely fabulous. And a great way to support us as well is by joining us as a member. Go to www.BBC Wildlife, don't confuse it, bbcwildlife.org.uk/join us. Now, Peter, we've also been gathering questions from members of the current staff. So let's just hear one that might be directed towards you.
Every wildlife hero has to start somewhere. So what first inspired you to explore the natural world?
As a small child, I was always interested in creepy crawlies and flowers and nature and so on and so forth. As Chris Baines used to say, I always remember Chris Baines saying, we were the sort of kids that collected tibblers and tadpoles in jam jars, although that's rather looked down on these days. So I was always interested, always involved. And really my motivation, as I said earlier, was finding out that the rest of the world didn't seem to share this enthusiasm for wildlife in towns and cities. And indeed, the BBC today, you know, when they introduce things on Springwatch and so on, they still have to sort of put in a caveat that you'll be surprised because we filmed this in the middle of a city. And they still haven't got out of that habit from all those decades ago. So I wanted to sort of spread the word and spread the news that the wildlife that shares our towns and cities with us, which, let's face it, is the wildlife that people experience in their day-to-day lives, not the wildlife when they go on holiday to a remote place that they enjoy, is helping people to access that, understand it, enjoy it, and to help the wildlife itself.
Do you think it's harder for young people to do that now than it was for you when you were a kid growing up, just because we are in a more built-up environment?
It's definitely harder. I mean, I'm a school governor, so I know that if a class of school children are being taken out for what used to be called nature study, or it tends to be something called forest schools or similar these days.
Yeah, my daughter has a forest school, a 5-year-old daughter has a forest school at the moment. Yeah, she loves it.
Yeah. The parents have to give written permission for the trip to be made and so on, and there's all that administration and bureaucracy. So it can no longer be a spur of the moment thing, like it's a nice day, let's go and spend an hour, you know, outside. So it is harder, but fortunately we've got a lot of dedicated people who work harder to make sure that the kids still get the inspiration and the opportunities.
And a final note on fundraising then, are you optimistic that the flow of money from central and local government is there, as well as the individual fundraising efforts that individuals put forward?
Well, at the moment, no, I'm not optimistic, because, you know, we've entered and we don't know when we're going to come out of a huge economic crisis. When people have got a choice of where the money's going to go and money's tight, then it's more difficult to get a hold of it. But I always had a saying when I was fundraising, was that whether the economic situation is good or bad, there's never any money for anything. First time you ask for something, they will say no anyway. Right? There's never any money for anything, but there's always some money for something, and you've just got to be able to find the key to unlock it.
Brilliant stuff, Peter. Thank you. Hashtag wildlife hero, Peter Shirley. Great to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed. Let me introduce now Dr. Alison Milward. Alison was one of the first employees of the Trust and a former chair as well. Alison is an environmental consultant with specialisms in community engagement and nature conservation. She's had the important job in the early days of mapping out the Trust's priorities, planning them and influencing others outside the Trust to support her. Alison, are you there?
I'm here.
Excellent, good, you are there. So that's my summary really of your sort of track record with the Trust. Is that a fair summary, would you say?
Yeah, at the start, yeah, very much that kind of agenda was what I was working on.
And what would you say your responsibilities were then in those early days?
We were feeling our way really in the early days, trying to work out actually what the community's priorities were. And somebody before I was employed by the Trust had the amazing brainwave of putting a piece onto the commercial TV channels, asking people to contact us and let us know if there was a piece of land at the bottom of their street that they were concerned about, that they knew was good for wildlife, but they were worried about whether it was protected, it was being managed, what its future was, what threats to development were being applied to it. So it was my real privilege to find myself going and sitting in church halls and people's living rooms and talking about what was happening down the road and whether we as a young wildlife trust would be able to help those local communities to protect those green spaces full of wildlife that they loved, but were concerned about. You know, there was a lot of benign neglect, Adrian, of the more natural green spaces in the conurbation. I mean, you can imagine in a post-industrial landscape, we had lots of holes in the ground, and there were lots of people who had an eye on what to fill those holes with, and mostly it was to do with rubbish. And therefore it became urban nature conservation became very oriented towards planning and working with local authority planners at a strategic level as well as at a local level to try and work out which of these places were rich enough for us to try and get designated as special sites of scientific interest. And places like Moseley Bog that you referred to. Joy Pfeiffer, one of my wildlife heroes, when I first joined the Trust, she was often referred to in the press as a housewife from Moseley. But that housewife from Moseley collected 12,000 signatures to a petition. When it became known that the church diocese wanted to sell off part of the land at Moseley Bog to build just half a dozen houses, but those half a dozen houses would have gone right across the spring line that fed the bog, which fed the the special plants in the bog, that had caused the bog to be designated as one of the very few urban sites of special scientific interest. And one of my most treasured possessions is a slide of Joy with her banner outside Birmingham Council House, resplendent, emblazoned with the word "Save Our Bog." Was that these messages had to be simple and they had to be driven home. Behind those community activists, we were one of the first trusts to employ graduate planners, Peter Woodward, Mike Dando, several others, and we had a planning unit for a few years. And it was their job to explore the possibilities of creating nature conservation strategies for each of the local authorities as well as the county council, and then taking on individual site issues. Now, of course, the Trust is still doing that today. Our biggest planning challenge in recent years has been HS2. And there was a lot of work went into defending the Trust position on that.
Sure. I'm just interested to hear about this community passion, though, because as someone who's lived pretty much all my life around the West Midlands, I know how much people value their green spaces. But I also know, and this is true of life generally, that people are only too happy to leave the hard work to somebody else. But generally, if a green space is threatened or is just simply neglected, have you found that there is a passion there from local people, even if it's a passion for somebody else to come in and do something to improve it or protect it?
Yeah, I mean, you can tell by my accent that I'm not a Brummie or a Black Country girl. I hail from the Northwest. And when I first got involved with the Trust, I really wanted to know that the people of Birmingham and the Black Country wanted nature on their doorsteps, that they were passionate about it. And I was lucky enough to have somebody sit in the greenhouse on top of Friends of the Earth warehouse back in 1980 and devise a plan for me to do some PhD research on community engagement in urban green spaces. And that gave me the chance to do some case study work with the communities from Plantsbrook Reservoirs and from Lecky Road in Walsall and from Queslett Quarry and several other places, to really get under the skin of that, Adrian, and find out, why these places were important to the local community. And then out of that research came our understanding that if we could collaborate with the local planners and the landscape architects and the local politicians, then we could actually work together to protect some of these spaces and enhance them, both for people and for wildlife. So that for me set the whole of my career came from those early years working with those communities.
Brilliant. Am I right in thinking that you were responsible for drawing up the first nature conservation strategy for local councils?
I wasn't responsible for doing the first one, no. Peter Woodward and Rachel Berger put together the first county-wide nature conservation strategy. And then that was followed by Mike Dando, who did the Black Country nature conservation strategy. Then me, Pete, and Rachel was involved in that as well, Pete, I think. We did the Birmingham nature conservation strategy in, was it 1984? Something like that. So we got complete coverage within a few years. And then since that time, we've had things like green infrastructure strategies that the local authorities have prepared. And we'll soon be needing something called nature recovery network plans as well, Adrian. So the need for that sort of strategic level of thinking about how all these places connect up and how we are able to get people into them and to explore them is still very, very pertinent today. And it's one of those things that needs updating all the time.
Well, let's see if we can get our next question from a member of the Trust's current staff.
Boris Johnson wants to build. Are you concerned that the government may weaken planning regulations that previous generations have fought for to protect our wildlife?
It is very worrying, and it needs to be caveated, doesn't it, with building our way out of the economic slump, but very much with the environment in mind. And we would, I think, as a trust, we would hope to be able to contribute to that economic recovery through the creation of new green jobs. That would be a real opportunity. But the weakening of planning legislation it's been incremental over many years now, and has not helped us in one respect. That said, just at the moment, Natural England are about to update what they call their green infrastructure standards, and that will impose on planning authorities the need to carefully consider development in the light of our need to protect nature and to protect natural green spaces for access by the public. So there is counter efforts going in, if you like, to strengthen certain areas of policy. But honestly, I regularly write letters of objection to my planning authority about proposals in my neighbourhood.
Yeah, does it work, Alison?
We've saved quite a bit of land where the old Readings rugby club used to be. I think you'll remember that. We've protected rights of way locally. We've taken the council to judicial review to stop unwelcome development in certain areas. So sometimes, yeah.
It can work. Brilliant. There we go. Wildlife hero Alison Milward, thank you so much. Now, next up, a man I've had the pleasure of interviewing on the radio in the past, a very vocal and effective campaigner for urban wildlife in Birmingham and the Black Country, Chris Baines. Chris has appeared on TV programmes as diverse as Gardener's World, Pebble Mill at 1, Country File, Charlie's Wildlife Gardens. He's written books such as How to Make a Wildlife Garden, and has been awarded a medal for conservation by the RSPB. So, Chris, welcome along. Tell us your memories of the early days of the Trust and the focus of your campaigning at that time.
I think what people don't realise now, 40 years later, is, as Peter was saying, what a revolution this was, really. And you mentioned the RSPB just now. I remember one of the very first campaigns was to try and stop one of those big holes that Alison was mentioning at Queslet Quarry being filled in with the city's waste. And I wrote to the RSPB to say this is a really important site. The kids love it. It's got wetlands in the bottom. It's a fantastic place. And the RSPB wrote back and said, there can't be anything of interest there. It's in the middle of Birmingham. In fact, we lost, as a consequence, we lost a colony of 200 pairs of sand martins that were nested in the cliffs of Queslet Quarry. So it was a revolution. And I think what was exciting was that you've got people like Peter and Mike who came from a natural history background. I mean, Peter didn't mention this, but he was a real expert, and still is, on gall wasps. I didn't even know what a gall wasp was, but I was passionate about the landscape and people. So there were those two groups of mavericks, if you like, from their territories. And then the third ingredient was this emotional strand that Alison mentioned with people like Joy Pfeiffer, who, with the greatest respect to Joy, didn't know the names of anything, didn't know how the system worked, but just were passionate and, you know, would bring people to tears with concerns about the wild space on their doorstep. You bring those three parties together, and it's a very powerful thing. And the main objections that we had came from, as Peter said, the traditional nature conservation organisations. So it was the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust, the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust and the Shropshire Wildlife Trust, who really thought that we were devaluing the currency of nature conservation by talking about people and talking about the inner city. So it was a very, very different time. And then we had this wonderful good fortune of Margaret Thatcher, the supreme unintended consequence of high unemployment, and then the response of the Manpower Services Commission and the employment schemes. And within certainly a year of us starting with nothing, we had, I think, 40 staff at one point. And as Alison was saying, we were employing more ecologists than all the local authorities across Birmingham and the Black Country put together. And we were able to take people like Peter Woodward, who were, you know, young, bright-eyed planners with no prospect of employment in the mainstream, and give them this fantastic opportunity to work with real places and real people. So it was a very, very different approach to nature conservation. And I think one of the things that we realized very early on was that we were never really going to own land. Land in the city was always going to be too expensive. But that there was, as Alison was saying, lots and lots of land out there that was wild, was green, and was threatened. And that maybe if we worked with the people who owned the land and influenced it, then we could begin to build a whole region-wide network of green spaces. And I remember one of the very early things that we did, we realized that the parks were key. Actually, Birmingham Parks were spending at that stage something like £12 million a year mowing grass and eliminating the wildlife. And we wanted to try and get them to begin to think more creatively about that resource. And so we ran what turned out to be very memorable. We leaked to the Birmingham Post the fact that Birmingham had been chosen as the site for the International Daisy Chain Championships of about 1981. And of course, nobody had ever heard of the International Daisy Chain Championships. It didn't really exist. But we then got in touch with the Parks Department and said, you've probably read in the Birmingham Post that Birmingham has been selected for the site of the International Daisy Chain Championships. What we need from you is about half an acre of daisies, please. And we think that if you actually just fence out the geese at the side of the boating lake in one of the parks, then actually the daisies will come up and flower. And that's exactly what they did in Cannon Hill Park. They put an electric fence around a big patch of the lawn that the geese just grazed and grazed and grazed. And in Canada geese, the daisies are known as gooseweed because they're the only thing that survives the geese. And they put the fence up, this fantastic white square of daisies appeared. Miraculously, a Birmingham school won the International Daisy Chain Championships. The mayor was photographed with daisy chains around his neck. But the result of that was that actually we then had a parks department that listened to us and was interested in change. And very quickly we had Sue Vincent, remember, who was on secondment for 3 days a week, I think, into the parks department. So we were working in a really very different kind of way, I think, from the way that nature conservation had been working previously. And I think it was the scientific credibility that came from people like Pete and Mike and a whole bunch of other people, combined with the understanding of how the planning systems and people like Rachel Berger understanding about landscape and planning processes, that combination was a killer, really. I mean, they didn't stand a chance.
But it's interesting, you know, you talk about those kind of stunts in the early days, getting the interest of the Birmingham Post, and Alison mentioned Joy Pfeiffer, another wildlife hero. Clearly, she's now commemorated, isn't she, at Moseley Bog with Joy's Field. You know, those kind of more eye-catching campaigning moments. Have they gone now? Is it much more about kind of polite partnership with local authorities and landowners?
I think we've become, as a conservation movement, we've become more sophisticated in thinking about where the influence lies. So the targeting is less scatterpattern and more focused. I mean, I remember when we, again, in the very early days, I think was the first elected chairman. There was a chairman before me, but and I was absolutely determined that we were not going to go down the route of the wildlife trusts of having to sell Christmas cards and tea towels in order to keep the membership happy. I'd spent some time with the garage full of tea towels and Christmas cards. I didn't want to do it again. But we did need members. We needed support. We needed to be able to demonstrate politically that we had backing. So we introduced a life supporter scheme, wherefore, now I can't remember if it was £0.50 or 50p, because it was kind of such a long time ago. But we set up people at New Street Station, and as the commuters got off in the morning, we offered them life supporter membership, and they got a badge in return for their A to Z page or their postcode. And the news headline was that membership increases by 8-fold in half an hour, or something ridiculous, you know. But what we needed was to be able to demonstrate to the politicians in the Parks Department and on the Planning Committee that we weren't just a bunch of green ink writing lunatics. We actually were representing a deep-rooted feeling. And I think one of the other heroes of the time was one of the councillors, Councillor Bird, who was on the Parks Committee. They still had one then. But he was a postman in real life, if you like. And when we started to talk about the foxes in the city and the importance of the canal networks and all of these things that nobody had ever talked about in conservation terms before, he understood, because he was up at 5:30 in the morning walking the streets, and he knew that there were urban foxes everywhere. So we were beginning to, I think, just touch a nerve with really key people. Now, those people are different. In a way, the message has got through at that kind of level much more soundly now than it was then. But now, as Alison was saying, you know, the big targets are things like HS2. Well, the untouchables in the process that are determining what happens with HS2, much more difficult to reach because they keep moving and they keep closing down and moving on, and they're unaccountable. So we've had to get, I think, much more sophisticated in the partnerships that we form. But what you can't take away from it is the need for the passion and the energy and the commitment, and the deep-rooted belief that in the end, people need nature in their lives. And if they're going to really get the benefit, it has to be where they live and work. It's no good that it's somewhere out in the Peak District, important though that is. It's the green space in the school grounds, it's the back garden, you know, it's the office courtyard, it's whether you can hear the birds singing while you're waiting for the bus. It's that kind of level that really is what we've been all about for 40 years, I think.
Let's get another one of the questions that have been asked by one of the current members of staff here.
Do you think that over the last 40 years, the barriers that stop children connecting with nature have increased? And if so, what can we do about it? How can we make sure that every child has a wild childhood?
I always say I was feral as a child. You know, my dad was the kind of school teacher that absolutely could be spontaneous. I met somebody not that long ago who'd been taught by him. She's a woman of 70 odd now, but she'd been taught by him when she was 6. And she said the most memorable day of her school childhood was the day when the snowdrifts were so deep outside the classroom that my dad insisted that the whole class went out and walked through the snowdrifts so that they could experience snow above their heads. And I just thought that is so far removed from anything you could possibly achieve now. I actually think what's changed is the media, the speed with which bad news travels. I don't actually think, and I'm not a parent, so I always feel a bit uncomfortable talking about this, but I think it's the parent paranoia which has changed. And that actually, I don't believe it's really any more dangerous out there than it was when I was building dens and digging holes and doing all the other stuff. It's just that the public perception is that it is, and that when something bad happens, everybody knows about it almost instantly. And it's a tragedy. And I think it's why things like gardens are so important, and school grounds are so important, and urban parks are so important, because increasingly those are the landscapes where you still have a fighting chance of making the daisy chain or building a den or dipping for tadpoles. The wilder landscapes, I mean, I spent my infancy in a quarry where I used to, you know, go at 8 in the morning, come back at 6 at night, covered in mud with a jam jar full of sticklebags. No doubt risking my life doing it, but actually that, very difficult to deliver that now. So we need to change the way in which gardens and parks and school grounds are managed to make sure that they're better than they have been in the past at providing that kind of opportunity.
Chris, thank you. Absolutely brilliant to hear from you. Really appreciate it. And as we've been saying all through this evening, if you've got a wildlife hero that you want to nominate, just hashtag wildlife hero either on Facebook or on Twitter. Many thanks indeed to Chris Baines, who certainly fits that particular bill. Next up, Mike Bloxham. Mike was an early volunteer for the Trust. He's done great work down the years, making records of insects in Sandwell Valley and beyond. He's going to talk to us about species recording. Mike, hello, welcome along. Just tell us how you first got involved in this fairly niche area.
Oh, well, I was very lucky because I was brought up with the very best scientists of the lot. I was a primary school teacher, and you and I think nearly everybody with us tonight will know that the best naturalists tend to be aged about 9, 10. And as a consequence, I've enjoyed all my teaching life, luckily in good surroundings. And the children I've been with I've managed to get to really enjoy wildlife. And also, all the time I was learning myself. And I think this is the wonderful thing about what we do. It's a learning experience all round. And so when I finished, I thought to myself, well, what can I do? I could loaf about, which I enjoy doing very much. But otherwise, I could do something else. And that was that particular moment that Peter Shirley got hold of me by the ear and said, we've got something for you to do here. And he introduced me to an important hero who's not here, and that was Craig Slawson. He would be here instead of me if he was still alive, but he died this year. And so this is dedicated to him.
Set up something I understand called the Eco Record, and you were involved in invertebrate recording with him. Is that right?
That's right. Craig was the big white chief of that, and he was a very strict in many ways in ensuring that duff records didn't find their way into a system that we got. Now let's go quickly back, if we can, to the early days of the Trust before I got on the scene. And here is a recording sheet. You'll never be able to read it, but this is what all those wonderful recorders who they talk about went out and got during the 80s, in the early days. And what we wound up with, of course, in 1992 was a great heap of reports, and this all had to be recorded. And this was the time, of course, when you all know the digital revolution was beginning to take off. There were all sorts of databases, and all the speakers here will have played around with them at one time or another. And English Nature, or as it was the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, turned up with Eco Record, which was a package we had to use, and Craig was in charge of it. What happened was then, of course, we got hard to work with all these forms. Incidentally, I love lists. I think they're absolutely fantastic, and we have them all shopping, but at the same time, a list of stuff is very, very valuable. And first of all, we had to deal with all these forms. Which meant all the site records and everything, and all the sites themselves were down on the database. Then after that, when we'd done that, we could do some other things. During the first 5 years or so, we spent most of our time putting the reports of all the surveyors in, but then we got on to other things. And luckily enough, I was able to do a bit of surveying myself, and we did. I think it's important to highlight the collaboration of the Trust with other organisations. And this was a tremendously important one here. This was with the University of Birmingham, East Side survey. You probably can't see it very clearly. That was the University Audit, the Biodiversity of East Side Birmingham. And we did a huge document the Trust did, working with the university, and that was all input as well, with well over 2,000 species recorded in Digbeth. The Trust is brilliant at working with other organisations.
What was the significance, though, of the Eco Record and the gathering of the records, for example, at Sandwell Valley that you were involved in? Why was that so important?
Simply because we've got to put a time, as it were, have a time capsule of where we are at this time. I think that's very important. We've got historic records from Sutton Park and places like that from 100 years ago. We've got to put our marker down for our time, I think. And the Trust has done this beautifully. We're putting down the marker for our time, and we're also got what I love, which is evidence. It isn't perfect, but there's an awful lot of it. Currently, on computer, there are, I think, 2,700,000 species records. That's about one for everybody in Birmingham and the Black Country, I think, probably, if you look at it like that.
Yeah.
It isn't of itself important as a list, but when everybody there starts to interpret it and put it in context, then it is extremely important. And furthermore, if somebody says what's on that site, if a councillor says that, you know, what's the value of that site? Well, you found on it. You then are in a position to present them with a list and reports, and this can be highly significant, much more so than a lot of people rate it. Facts, very important.
Yes. Mike, let's have a listen now to one of the current members of staff at the Trust who's got a question for you. Just listen to this.
Hi. So we're all quite aware of the catastrophic decline of insects that have been happening across the world at the moment, and in Europe and the United Kingdom. What is it that we can do as individuals to help reverse insect decline?
I think that the main thing that we can do, and we've got to do, is to get out of this business of the virtual, which is dogging us so badly at the moment, and into the actual business of wildlife. And I think we've got to make people, or we've got to have an atmosphere where people are actually sensitive to the fact that wildlife has a life of its own. And it also, we've got to get in harmony with that somehow, which means what Chris was talking about previously. We really have got to engage with our green areas, and we've got to start insisting that green areas are intensely important. We've watched them going down like ninepins, and the danger of is more of them will do so. And then we have to get our children and also our adults, in fact our families and our communities, out there practically on them. So walks, all sorts of clever ideas. And once again, Chris is an expert on this. Those are the most important things. Habitat conservation is desperately important. Habitat conservation of all sorts within reach of where people are, and somehow contriving to get our families out there and experience the actual wildlife. Virtual wildlife is all over the television and all over the computer. It ain't a patch on real wildlife.
So how can people get involved then? What practical steps can people take if they want to do more than just watch pretty pictures on television?
Every family has got to go out with some kit. I've got favourite kit which I take. Here's one of my favourite pieces of kit, the ball of string. I don't know if it shows up very well on there. The ball of string is absolutely fantastic. If you find a tree, you can put a piece of string around it and find out what its girth is and measure it. Trees are incredibly endangered, the larger ones. That's absolutely wonderful to take with you. Everybody's got a camera, everybody's got an iPhone and things like that. You take them. Here's a wonderful gadget, which we all ought to have. You know, the old trail camera. This is very popular now. You can get them reasonably inexpensively. Put them in the garden and see if you can see Mr. Fox with his white eyes in the middle of the night. Absolutely fantastic. I wouldn't be without it. Lots of things like that. You can, if you want to be very posh, you can take a measuring tape, which is absolutely grand and wonderful, and a terrific thing to have in your pocket. And you get into trouble with everybody at home because you've nicked it and taken it out in the field with you. There's a tremendous amount of engagement by people. The opportunities are there, and we've got to hit them very hard now as we come towards the end of this crisis, I believe, when everybody will be longing to get back to real life. It's an opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, there is an argument, isn't it, that tragic though it has been for many people, that COVID-19 has actually been a boon for our appreciation of the nature, the wildlife on our doorstep.
Yes, I think as everybody in the panel would agree, events always produce opportunities. And the important thing is we've all got to be alert to them. We have to be alert to other things as well in this business of recording. Here's a CD. Here's a memory stick. You've got the sequence, didn't you? What we're dealing with is big tech as we go into recording, and it's becoming a bit of a nightmare. We've got conflicting recording schemes. You've got to watch that you don't lose data. Stuff in the cloud is quite dangerous, and so I've got a recommendation to everybody. Keep your notebook.
good old-fashioned back to basics. Mike Bloxham, thank you. If people do want to find out more, by the way, about the Eco Record, you can go to www.ecorecord.org.uk. And another way to get practically involved is to use the iNaturalist app, which allows you to record the species that you spot on the go. So my thanks indeed to Mike Bloxham, to Chris Baines, to Alison Milward, and to Peter Shirley, hashtag Wildlife Heroes All. It's been a real pleasure, fascinating glimpse as well into the past and the development of the Trust, and a real honour to speak to you all as well about the development of the Trust over the years and its current plans as well. So thank you very much indeed, all four. I'll hand back now to Delia.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's just been totally wonderful. I've really enjoyed finding out so much about the history of the organisation. It's been fantastic. I just want to say a big thank you to our host Adrian, and of course all of our special guests. We hope this event has inspired you to become a wildlife hero, perhaps recording species, making homes for wildlife, or perhaps helping us to fundraise. And if you think you know a wildlife hero, maybe you should think about nominating them for a National Lottery Awards, and we'll be posting more information about how to do this on our social media in the coming days, so do look out for that. So thank you everyone, it's been fantastic.